They called it the silence. Not because there were no warnings, there were. Alarms had blared. Data poured in from every corner of the globe. Scientists debated, generals shouted, and world leaders convened under banners of last-minute unity. But in the end, when it happened, it was quiet. Too quiet. No explosions. No alien invasion. No blinding light from the skies. Just the sudden void. Cities went dark one by one. Satellites fell from orbit like dead birds. Oceans stilled, then boiled. The earth, once overflowing with defiance and noise, went mute as if the universe had pressed a single finger to its lips. No one agreed on what caused it. Some claimed a rogue artificial intelligence born from human arrogance turned against its creators. Others whispered of something ancient, older than stars, woken beneath the Arctic by melting ice. A few insisted Earth had simply reached its natural expiration, the culmination of centuries of abuse and neglect. None of it mattered. No theory reversed the devastation. No science, no God, no miracle arrived. The truth was brutal in its clarity: Earth was dying, and humanity with it. Panic set in first. Then order. A desperate, fragile order formed by the ones who saw clearly: survival meant escape. Not salvation. Not victory. Just getting out before the cradle burned completely. The exodus began. Every ship that could carry human life was reconfigured, retrofitted, repurposed. Thousands launched, most never reported back. Space was cruel, and Earth's reach had always been shallow. In the end, only a fraction of the billions made it through, people chosen not by wealth or power, but by usefulness. Engineers, medics, technicians, AI specialists, builders, thinkers. The minds needed to rebuild, not relive. The destination was obvious. Mars. Not because it was ideal. It wasn't. Mars was a graveyard waiting to happen. But it was there. It was known. And most importantly, it was the only place humanity had ever stepped foot on outside their dying world. They left behind everything. Cities, histories, languages, songs. Mothers burying children in collapsing bunkers. Lovers saying goodbye with no promise of reunion. The Earth's final moments weren't marked by war, but by weight. The weight of goodbye, of surrender, of knowing you were the last to see the oceans, the forests, the blue sky. Those who made it through the atmosphere of Mars did so not as explorers but as exiles. Refugees clinging to a rock that never wanted them. The first breath inside a Martian habitat wasn't relief, it was grief. For Earth, for the billions left behind, for the knowledge that they hadn't conquered space. They had run from annihilation. And yet, there was no time to mourn. Mars did not care. It offered no comfort. Oxygen was scarce. Water was locked in poisoned soil, and ice that burned the flesh. The wind howled like a vacuum, and the radiation was a silent executioner waiting for systems to fail. Food was a calculation, not a meal. Every breath was borrowed from machines that whispered, "Keep going. Just a little longer." The leadership that emerged wasn't elected, it was earned. People who fixed oxygen leaks while coughing up blood. People who walked into radiation storms to restart a reactor. There were no countries now. No flags. Only functions. There were debates, of course. Arguments. Despair. But they were short-lived. Survival allowed no luxuries. Failure meant death, and death meant extinction. Earth was gone. There was no plan C. Children asked what Earth was like. Their parents described it in whispers. Grass. Rain. Blue. The words felt alien even to the adults. Mars didn't allow for memories. It demanded focus. They learned quickly that waiting for rescue was a fantasy. There were no saviors. The ones who fled were the ones who remained. This was humanity now: red dust, black sky, and machines humming through the dark. But in the silence that followed Earth's end, there was something else. Something small, quiet, persistent. A heartbeat. Humanity's heartbeat. Weakened, slowed, but still beating. Not a roar, not a shout. Just the steady rhythm of people refusing to be erased. Mars did not welcome them. It tested them. From the moment the first settlers stepped onto its regolith, it made its hostility clear. The air was unbreathable, a thin whisper of carbon dioxide and dust. The cold pierced reinforced suits like needles. Within days, the first deaths occurred, not in disasters or explosions, but quietly in failed seals, frozen limbs, slow suffocation. Every mistake was fatal. They had arrived with technology, but not enough. What survived the journey was limited, degraded, barely functioning. Habitats were rushed together using broken parts and cannibalized landers. Power was erratic. Life support strained under demand. A cracked seal or minor system error meant a room full of bodies by morning. Still, they worked. Underground became the only option. They dug, using ancient mining bots and improvised drills. Subsurface tunnels provided insulation and limited protection from radiation. Every meter carved was an hour stolen from death. They lived shoulder to shoulder in makeshift corridors, converted cargo holds, inflatable domes patched with tape and prayer. Water came from melting ice deposits, filtered and recycled endlessly. No drop was wasted. Showers were extinct. Drinking was measured to the milliliter. Oxygen was stripped from regolith using high-energy electrolysis, feeding thin reservoirs of breathable air. When a generator went offline, everyone held their breath, not figuratively. Literally. Food was worse. No seeds survived the radiation unscathed. The first attempts at agriculture failed miserably. What they had was synthesized nutrient paste grown from algae and yeast, a green slurry that sustained but never satisfied. Palates adapted. Complaints ceased. Hunger was no longer emotional, it was mathematical. Mental collapse came swiftly. Earth had provided sky, color, sound. Mars gave none. Just static in helmets, darkness in tunnels, and the ever-present red dust that clung to skin, lungs, minds. People lost themselves in silence. Suicide became an early epidemic. It was addressed harshly. No one could afford the luxury of despair. Rules changed. There were no prisons. A crime meant exile, a death sentence. Conflict resolution was immediate. Those who refused to contribute were given one warning. After that, they disappeared. Harsh, but necessary. Survival had no room for morality as Earth once defined it. From this, a new kind of human began to form. They called themselves the Forge-born. Not in arrogance, but in recognition. They weren't Earthlings anymore. Earth was mythology. The stars were unreachable. Mars was the only truth, and the only measure of worth was utility. Leadership wasn't voted in, it was earned through results. Titles faded. Names meant less than function. You were what you did. Children born in the first wave of Martian colonies were different. Smaller, denser bones. Higher tolerance for low-oxygen environments. Their lungs adapted. Their minds matured faster. They didn't cry over sunsets they'd never seen. They spoke in direct terms. Clarity was survival. Education became engineering, biology, mechanics. Poetry, art, and history were not erased, but they were archived. Access was granted once duties were fulfilled. Leisure existed only after energy production, oxygen systems, and food synthesis were confirmed stable. Even play was structured, designed to reinforce physical resilience and cognitive endurance. Technology evolved with necessity. Printing labs produced custom tools using Martian polymers. Prosthetics were advanced beyond Earth's standards. When someone lost a limb to decompression or mechanical failure, they were back to work within days, enhanced. Pain was treated, but not avoided. It became part of life. The first true Martian society was formed not by politics, but by protocols. A communal AI managed logistics, neutral, efficient, emotionless. There were no lies, no illusions. Resources were finite, and survival required submission to order. Freedom was redefined. Freedom meant the ability to exist one more day. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, they began to build. Slowly, methodically, habitats became cities. Not in the Earth sense, No skyscrapers or parks, but interlinked structures of logic and function. Hydroponic towers fed hundreds. Water reclamation centers became sacred spaces. Power was drawn from fusion cores that had once powered starships. Lights stayed on longer. The temperature stabilized. And above all, people stopped dying. That was the turning point, not an invention or breakthrough, but a single stretch of months where no one died from Mars itself. No leaks, no starvation, no air loss. It wasn't victory. It wasn't comfort. But it was control. They hadn't tamed Mars. But they had learned how to live with it. Not by bending it to their will, but by adapting to its terms. And in doing so, they forged something no simulation or Earth laboratory had ever predicted, a blueprint for survival that had nothing to do with conquering and everything to do with enduring. They no longer looked to Earth for identity. The people who now breathed recycled air beneath Martian stone understood that memory alone wasn't enough to shape a future. Survival had carved something new into them, something irreversible. Mars didn't just take from them, it remade them. The first generation born on Mars didn't dream in blue. Their sky was rust and shadow. They didn't mourn rain or trees because they'd never seen either. Their lungs adapted to thinner air. Bone density treatments began in infancy. Their muscles were conditioned under low-gravity protocols. The first full genetic editing procedures were approved after trials showed that small changes, denser marrow, enhanced radiation resistance, meant drastically lower mortality. This generation was engineered, not just raised. Not in pursuit of perfection, but functionality. They weren't stronger than Earth-born humans. They were different. More efficient. Emotionally tempered. Faster to process logic, slower to panic. Their neural development was tracked and optimized from birth. Childhood was redefined. Education started at 2. Play was integrated into problem-solving routines. By 10, they could troubleshoot a power grid. By 12, they debated ethics with machine minds. Language evolved. Martian Standard emerged, a streamlined, hybrid dialect designed for clarity and brevity. Sentences shortened. Ambiguity was phased out. Efficiency reached even into thought. Earth's romanticism faded into archive files. Practicality was culture now. Social structures shifted with environment. Hierarchies flattened. Roles rotated based on aptitude assessments. Merit replaced lineage. Family was no longer defined by biology, but by chosen function. Communal child-rearing became the norm. Bonds were built through shared labor and trial, not tradition. Marriage, as Earth had known it, became rare. Partnership was based on compatible utility, emotional, intellectual, and operational. Religion changed. Some clung to old beliefs. Most moved on. The dominant spiritual framework centered around entropy and defiance. Not worship, but reverence for existence against odds. They didn't pray for salvation, they honored survival. Rituals emerged around resource milestones, a new oxygen processor, a stabilized crop yield, a full Martian year without fatality. Each became sacred. Technology blurred the line between human and machine. Neural links were normalized. Memory supplements enhanced retention. Emotional regulation chips helped manage trauma responses. External wearables monitored vitals and behavior, offering real-time mental health feedback. The taboo of augmentation evaporated. The question wasn't whether to enhance, it was what to prioritize. Cybernetic limbs became more than replacements, they were upgrades. Eyes were modified to detect structural weaknesses in real time. Audio filters allowed individuals to communicate clearly through Martian winds. The Martian-born viewed these changes not as loss of humanity, but as evolution's next step, conscious, calculated, necessary. Art survived, but it transformed. Expression became data-driven. Music was coded in pulse rhythms that synced with life support systems. Sculpture became structural, carved into tunnel supports and pressure locks. Beauty was integrated with function. Utility was aesthetic. Even color theory shifted. Red dominated early designs, then was abandoned for clean, muted palettes meant to preserve mental focus and reduce sensory fatigue. Individualism didn't vanish. It adapted. People weren't expected to conform to a single model. But deviation had to serve purpose. Innovation was welcomed, so long as it improved conditions. Creativity thrived, but under pressure. Every idea was tested. Theory without application had no place. A Martian could challenge any protocol, but had to prove their alternative in simulation before proposing implementation. Leadership was dynamic. Rotational councils formed by performance data rather than popularity. Emotional stability was weighted alongside intelligence. Leaders were trained in crisis response and conflict diffusion, not rhetoric. Power wasn't held. It was borrowed and returned. They didn't seek to rebuild what was lost. They learned from its failure. Earth had splintered under pride, scarcity, and illusion. Mars permitted none of those luxuries. Transparency was law. Lies cost lives. Status was temporary. Only function endured. When the first orbital station linked successfully to the Martian surface, it wasn't celebrated with speeches. It was logged, documented, and immediately folded into logistical planning. The milestone wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what came next. Humanity had not only survived Mars. It had become Martian. And the being that emerged wasn't weaker for the loss of Earth. It was colder. Smarter. Sharper. Not less human, but no longer bound by Earth's definition of what human meant. Contact changed everything. It wasn't a signal from the stars or a visitation from something greater. It was debris, wreckage that wasn't theirs. A strange alloy structure found half buried beyond the eastern ridge, uncovered during a routine expansion survey. The material didn't match any Earth-born composition, and its design was mathematically alien. Not decorative, not random, precise, layered in patterns that didn't fit human logic. Analysis took weeks. What they uncovered wasn't a vessel or a beacon. It was architecture. Ancient. Abandoned. Older than Earth's earliest civilizations. A structure built with intention, now dormant, half destroyed by time or catastrophe. Radiation levels spiked near its core. Not dangerous, but artificial. Its interior resisted entry, seals tighter than anything human engineers had designed. They didn't announce the discovery to the entire colony. Only key scientific teams and strategic leadership were informed. If the object represented a threat, panic was a risk they couldn't afford. Quietly, they initiated decoding protocols. Linguistics teams worked beside AI clusters to dissect the symbols carved into the inner walls. They weren't letters, they were commands. Instructions, maybe. Possibly warnings. But what mattered more than what it said was what it implied. They were not alone. The realization didn't cause fear. It triggered calculation. If others had come before and failed, then Mars wasn't just hostile, it was selective. Survivors weren't chosen by chance, but by design. Whatever had built the structure hadn't survived here. Humanity had. This truth reshaped their focus. Expansion halted. Resources were redirected. Study became priority. Excavation methods adapted. Drones mapped every inch of the structure's perimeter, revealing more interlinked chambers, subsurface conduits, energy traces embedded in the stone. This wasn't a relic. It was a system. The discovery redefined Mars. It wasn't just a red rock they tamed. It was a test. A crucible. Something had come before and failed to endure. But humanity hadn't. They'd adapted, endured, evolved. Where others vanished, they'd held on. As deeper access was achieved, they found remnants, fragments of non-human skeletons, decayed organic materials woven into synthetic threads. No weapons. No signs of war. Whatever happened here hadn't been violent. It had been internal. Collapse from within. A species advanced enough to build beyond their own biology had still fallen to Mars' relentless demands. The parallel wasn't lost on them. Warnings embedded in the alien markings began to make sense. Phrases translated loosely into principles. Form must yield to function. Emotion corrupts structure. Pride precedes decay. They weren't metaphysical. They were operational philosophies. Protocols etched into architecture. Humanity understood. The Martian leadership initiated systemic reform. Not out of fear, but clarity. The alien extinction wasn't a mystery, it was a model. Failure didn't come from external forces, but internal breakdown. Complacency, ego, divergence from function. Mars had no mercy for those who forgot purpose. New policies integrated the alien lessons. Efficiency thresholds were increased. Emotional interference in decision-making was flagged and corrected. AI oversight became more autonomous. Critical systems were no longer debated, they were obeyed. Habitats were restructured using alien geometries, maximizing structural integrity and energy flow. Resistance existed. Not all welcomed the changes. Some argued that embracing an extinct species protocols would repeat their failure. But simulations showed otherwise. Incorporating alien architecture stabilized energy grids by 14%. Atmospheric regulators improved by 9%. Results overruled sentiment. The colony's tone shifted. Not colder, more focused. Curiosity remained, but it became strategic. Knowledge was valuable only if it served continuity. Archives were updated. History was rewritten. Mars wasn't a new beginning. It was a filter. Only the adaptable survived. Eventually, they activated the structure's core. A pulse surged through its walls, silent, measured, calculated. No signal left Mars. No new visitors arrived. But systems inside powered up. Lights illuminated corridors unseen for millennia. And in the heart of the structure, a chamber opened. Inside was no treasure, no technology, no message. Just a mirror. Flawless. Standing alone. It reflected the human researchers back at themselves, not as they were, but as they had become. Hardened. Precise. Unyielding. It was not a gift. It was confirmation. They had passed. Not because they were chosen, but because they had made themselves worthy. It started with the children. The third generation, born entirely on Mars, had no memory of flight or exodus. They didn't carry the psychological scars of loss or the burden of nostalgia. They weren't running from a fallen Earth. They were building forward, eyes focused ahead, instincts wired to solve, adapt, construct. For them, Mars was not a sentence, it was a proving ground. Their biology reflected this evolution. Subtle changes, across decades of adaptation, had shifted their baseline. Higher cognitive efficiency under stress. Faster metabolic recovery. Communication habits that leaned toward precision. Conflict resolution was instinctual, rooted in logic over emotion. No instruction had taught them that, environment had. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving in a system shaped by necessity, honed by extinction. With the activation of the alien structure, priorities shifted again. The mirror they'd uncovered wasn't symbolic, it was directive. The message was clear: continue, or stagnate. No further contact came. No other species emerged. But the lesson had been embedded: refinement or failure. The Martians took it literally. They reorganized. Resource allocation was no longer merely about survival. It focused on advancement. Not expansion in space, expansion in capability. Biotech labs accelerated development of neural integration. Individuals could now interface seamlessly with colony systems, operating environmental controls, defense grids, fabrication processes through thought. Work became distributed across minds, not just hands. Language further condensed. Visual markers replaced words in critical operations. Data streams replaced meetings. Decision-making accelerated. Collective feedback loops removed inefficiency. Hierarchy flattened further. Authority came from demonstrated effectiveness, reviewed in real time by AI adjudicators. Emotion was not erased, but rerouted. Rituals evolved to express grief, joy, connection through engineered experiences, shared memory pools, immersive simulations tailored to maintain mental balance without disrupting operational focus. Art returned, not as rebellion but as reinforcement, sculptures encoded with system performance data, music composed from telemetry patterns, poetry built on quantum randomness. Expression became functional. Identity merged with output. Defense systems were developed, not against enemies, but entropy. Microswarm drones repaired external damage before alarms triggered. Terraforming efforts moved beyond atmosphere management to targeted biosphere simulations. Mars began to shift, not into Earth, but into something stable, scalable, modular. Not terraforming, it was reforming, in their image. Earth was no longer mentioned with longing. It existed as archive, referenced in training simulations, cultural retrospectives, historical analytics. What had been a cradle became a caution. What had been lost was acknowledged, not mourned. Humanity had not returned to its roots. It had buried them. Then came Project Ascension. It wasn't a launch. There were no ships, no destinations. It was a transition of state. Physical and cognitive integration into a distributed system, a collective operating framework built on human minds, enhanced by machine precision, stabilized by Martian protocols. Not hive mind. Not singularity. Cooperative autonomy. Individuals retained selfhood, but operated within shared systems of thought. Decision velocity increased exponentially. Disagreement didn't vanish, it optimized. Project Ascension wasn't imposed. It was offered. Participation rates reached 94% in under a Martian year. Resistance existed, but was respected. Dissenters were given resources, space, autonomy. But their influence waned as their limitations became evident. With the ascended, construction reached planetary scale. Underground networks linked habitats into a continuous ecosystem. Surface domes became redundant. They moved deeper, building layered vertical cities in the crust. Thermal energy powered everything. Artificial gravity fields stabilized structural zones. No element went to waste. Mars itself became infrastructure. Time changed. The old calendar was retired. Days and years were tracked in cycles of progress, not rotations. Culture became aligned to output metrics. Generations were measured not by age, but by iteration, each cohort improving on the last, not through inheritance but design. They were no longer adapting to Mars. They were rewriting it. And in doing so, they rewrote themselves. Not into gods, not into machines, but into something that belonged here. Something that no longer required origin myths or destiny narratives. They had become the outcome of pressure, scarcity, choice. Not chosen by the stars, not guided by fate. Forged by necessity. The species that had fled Earth died in the silence of that first Martian night. What remained, what grew, was something else. Still human. But undeniably more.